waiting far too many weeks for this. So, Yalla Achim, pray with me in your language, whatever your language is. I'm just going to play quietly through. It's okay if it's English, pray in English, whatever. But I know we have Maori here, we have, what else do we have? We have Tongan, we have Indian, Fijian, Inuit. Now that we're all in the same room, let me hear you pray. Sababa. Woo! Voila. Okay, now let's get some practice in for the Olam Haba, when we'll all be speaking Ivrit. No, I'm joking. It's not true. It's not true. Revelation says that people from every tribe, every ethnicity, every nation will come in praise before the Lord our God. You will retain your ethnicity. We will all pray in our own language and give glory to God.
One, he made my toe.
Wow, just wow. Baruch Hashem. Baruch Hashem. Elohim Gadol. All blessing is from God. God is great. I'm just interpreting my own tongue. Beseder. Akol beseder. Is that okay? Everything's okay? Beseder gamor. Toda. Okay, so Bethany's been doing such a great job reading the passage for us each week. I was going to get her to do that for us again tonight. She'll be reading from the TLV, the Tree of Life version, which is an English translation done by various Messianic Jewish scholars and rabbis, mostly from North America, and it just gives us a little bit of a Jewishy feel in English. And so she's going to read the entire passage tonight of HaBesorah al Pi Yochanan, the Gospel according to John, chapter 11. This is one I can't divide up because of continuity. Essentially, the whole passage regards the both pre, during, and post Lazarus episode, and so we really can't divide it up. So we are going to do the entire portion of chapter 11 tonight. So Bethany, over to you.
Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Miriam and her sister Martha. This was the same Miriam who anointed the master with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. It was her brother Lazarus who was sick. So the sisters sent a word to Yeshua saying, "Master, the one you love is sick." When Yeshua heard this, he said, "This sickness will not end in death. It is for God's glory, so that Ben Elohim may be glorified through it." Now Yeshua loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. However, when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. Then after this he said to his disciples, "Let's go up to Judea again." "Rabbi," the disciples say to him, "just now the Judean leaders were trying to stone you, and you're going to go back there?" Yeshua answered, "Aren't there 12 hours in the day? If a man walks in the day, he doesn't stumble, because he sees the light of the world. But if a man should walk around at night, he stumbles because the light is not in him." After he said this, he tells them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up." So the disciples said to him, "Master, if he has fallen asleep, he will get better." Now Yeshua had spoken about his death, but they thought he was talking about ordinary sleep. Then Yeshua told them clearly, "Lazarus is dead. I'm glad for your sake I wasn't there, so that you may believe. Anyway, let's go to him." Then Thomas, called the twin, said to the other disciples, "Let's go too, so that we may die with him." So when Yeshua arrived, he discovered that Lazarus had been in the tomb already for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many of the Judeans had come to Martha and Miriam to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Yeshua was coming, she went out to meet him, but Miriam sat in the house. Martha said to Yeshua, "Master, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. But I know even now that whatever you may ask of God, he will give you." Yeshua said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Yeshua said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, even if he dies, shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, Ben Elohim, who has come into the world." After she said this, she left and secretly told her sister Miriam, "The teacher is here and he's calling for you." As soon as Miriam heard, she quickly got up and was coming to him. Now Yeshua had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. The Judeans who were with Miriam in the house and comforting her, seeing how quickly she got up and went out, followed her. They thought she was going to the tomb to weep there. So when Miriam came to where Yeshua was, She saw him and fell at his feet, saying to him, "Master, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Yeshua saw her weeping, and the Judeans who came with her weeping, he was deeply troubled in spirit and himself agitated. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Master, and tell him." They tell him. Yeshua wept, so the Judeans said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Couldn't this one who opened the eyes of the blind man have also kept this man from dying?" So Yeshua, again deeply troubled within himself, comes to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Yeshua says, "Roll away the stone." Martha, the dead man's sister, said to him, "Master, by this time he stinks. He's been dead for 4 days." Yeshua says to her, "Didn't I tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they rolled away the stone. Yeshua lifted up his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but because of this crowd standing around, I said it, so that they may believe that you sent me." And when he had said this, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" He who had been dead came out, wrapped in burial clothes, binding his hands and feet with a cloth over his face. And Yeshua tells them, "Cut him loose and let him go." Therefore many of the Judeans who had come to Miriam and had seen what Yeshua had done put their trust in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Yeshua had done. So the ruling Kohanim and Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. "What are we doing?" they asked. "This man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our holy place and our nation." But one of them, Caiaphas, who was Kohen Gadol that year, said to them, "You know nothing. You don't take into account that it is better for you that one man die for the people rather than for the whole nation to be destroyed." Now he did not say this by himself, but as the Kohen Gadol that year, he prophesied that Yeshua would die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but also so that he might gather together into one the scattered children of God. So from that day on, they plotted to kill him. Therefore Yeshua no longer walked openly among the Judeans, but went from there to the country near the wilderness, to a city called Ephraim. He stayed there with his disciples. Now the Jewish Passover was near, and many people went up out of the regions to Jerusalem before Passover, to purify themselves. So they were searching for Yeshua, saying to one another as they stood in the temple, "What do you think? Won't he come to the feast at all?" Now the ruling Kohanim and Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where he was, he should report it so that they might arrest him.
Well read, Rebitson. Toda rabba. So you've been looking at that opening picture for quite a while now, eh? A little bit different from what you might be used to looking at when you hear about this story, really. I certainly haven't seen pictures like this a lot when this story has been taught to me. The people in this picture are dressed essentially how the Mizrahim from Iraq, Iran, Yemen were dressed when they were kicked out of their countries, or in fact pogroms began when Israel became a state and they fled their own countries of residence and returned to Israel. Close to 1 million of them were kicked out of countries like Iran, Iraq, Yemen, and others. And they came dressed much like this. And they had in fact retained a lot of the Eastern Jewish cultural clothing and ancient practice, even from as far back as the 1st century. In fact, in their wedding practice, they continue to retain some of the more ancient wedding customs of Israel, customs of betrothal and marriage. And what they did, in fact, when they came back into Israel, which now has become a modern state, they really brought back to those Ashkenazim that came from Europe and other places, they brought back to them things that they had lost touch with. So that even today, in many cases, even amongst some Ashkenazim in Israel, you'll see wedding celebrations where even Ashkenaz dress up much like some of their more Eastern brothers. So the return of these groups of Mizrahi means Eastern, from the East, and in fact all Jews are from the East regardless, even if they are Ashkenaz. But what this was, it was like a gift from God, like a time capsule from God, brought back to the wholeness of the Jewish nation. And this is more like what the first century Jewish community would have looked than pretty much any other image that I've seen presented to me in regard to the story, the true account of the resurrection of El-Azar, Lazarus. Okay, El-Azar is his name in Ivrit. It means God is my helper. So I thought it would be great to dwell on that a little bit, and you've had a good chance to do that. As you know, my translation is a convergent translation using the Greek, the Aramaic, the Hebrew text, and some of my commentary will include Talmudic Hebrew, it varies also, and Rabbinic Hebrew, which varies again. And obviously, various parts of what Christians call the Old Testament are actually written in small part in Aramaic, an exilic language, the trade language of the known world at the time. But then in the New Testament, we have these transliterated Hebrew and Aramaic words, which make it clear that the writer is thinking as a Hebrew and writing in Greek. So it's to our advantage to know what each of these texts are conveying, and so that's why I've translated this way. And tonight you guys are aware that we're doing Habis Oral Pi Yochanan, the Gospel according to John, in chapter 11. So we're going to start. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the line upon line, precept upon precept, according to the command of the Tanakh. And then at the end, I'll give you an opportunity to ask questions. Eliyahu, Hawav Eliyahu, Kol HaKavod, he had suggested a couple of weeks ago, it'd be a great idea for people actually, while we're going through, if you have a question, note it down. Because what's likely is that you'll have a question at a certain point, but by the end of the chapter, you will have forgotten what your question was for verse 3. Because we're now at verse 42 type thing. So if you have a question, note it down in your phone notes or write it down on a notebook. Maybe in future bring a notebook and a pen, because we really do want to hear your questions. It's just been difficult in the past to get through the study when we've allowed the questions to happen constantly. So we want to hear them, but let's put them at the end. So that's just a suggestion. I thought it was a great suggestion from Eliyahu. Okay, let's read the first verse here in the translation that I've made. Moreover, a certain one was sick, weak, powerless. El-Azar, God helps, of Beit Anya, the house of answering. The village of Miriam, okay, and most English Bibles say Mary, and her sister Martha. Interesting, Miriam, named after that great heroine of Israel, the sister of Moshe, and her name means from rebellion. Interesting. And Martha, her name means mistress of myrrh or bitter mistress. So I just think it's interesting to understand the meanings of the names. It was the Miriam who anointed the Lord with perfumed resin and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother El-Azar, that means again, God helps, was sick, weak, powerless. Okay, so I'm just trying to convey the fullness of the meaning of the word. interesting that Yohanan, the author of this gospel, is so specific about which Miriam he's referring to. Yeah. It's a little bit, it's kind of like when we read in the Greek text, we have Ho Isus, we have the Jesus, the Yeshua. Not Yeshua, but the Yeshua. You see, he does this in part because if you say Yeshua in first century Israel, you're going to have every farmer and his son come running. What's dinner already? Yalla. Oh, they wouldn't have said yalla, but they would have said walla. No, they wouldn't have said that either. This is all Arabic, I bet they would have come running, and there would have been a lot of them, because essentially it's kind of like Joshua today in an English schoolroom. A few years ago, Joshua was so popular, if you'd said Joshua, half the kids would have come to the front of the class. And the same with Miriam. She's a hero of Israel, so a lot of daughters are named Miriam. This is one of the reasons Yohanan is saying, this particular Miriam, you know the one, there's a famous story about her, that she wiped Yeshua's feet with resined oil, with perfumed oil. A famous story about her. This also tells us that Yohanan's audience was probably about a generation after the events. So this story about Miriam was now well known amongst the believing Yehudim, Jewish people, and even had started to become known amongst Goyim, the Gentiles throughout the known world. And that's interesting because later on in this same chapter, we're told about the redemption of the Yehudim, called nation in that translation, and I'll explain to you why nation is a poor translation in a minute. And also those children of God dispersed throughout the world. So there's a little pointer toward the fact that not only will Jews come to Messiah, but also Goyim, nations, Gentiles will come. It's interesting that he's named her for this particular incident where she anoints the feet, weeps over Yeshua, because in Yohanan's gospel, that incident hasn't been mentioned yet. In fact, we'll see that incident occur in the next chapter. So there's another thing at work here where Yohanan presumes that his readers are also familiar with the other Gospels where that particular incident is named prior to this chronology. So he presumes that of his readers, which means that all of the Gospels were in circulation at the time. And I think that's interesting to know. Now let's take a look at the map so you can see where Bethany is, Beit Anya, the house of answering, in the red dot is Bethany, and that black dot on the other side of the Ardennes, the Jordan, is where we left Yeshua and his disciples in the past chapter. Remember, they had gone across to where Yohanan the Immerser had been ministering. And so you can see that it's quite a long way. I mean, I think 100 kilometres is a long way. I'm not the fittest person, so I would probably struggle making that distance in a short time. But it's good for you to understand the distance there. So we're talking about half a day's walk from where the disciples and Yeshua were to get to Bethany, which of course is very close to Yerushalayim. So it's great to have that visual cue. And I was reminded by Leanne that she finds those pictures helpful, and so does my wife. So I try to put pictures in when I can. Verses 3 and 4. So the sisters, that's Miriam and Martha, sent to him, that's Yeshua, saying, Lord, behold, now pay attention. He whom you love as a dear friend is sick, weak, powerless. But when Yeshua heard this, he said, this sickness, infirmity, weakness will not be to the advantage of death. Language is different, isn't it? I'm going to read it again it's starkly different from English translations, but it's quite literally what the Greek text says. Okay? So, but when Yeshua heard this, he said, this sickness, infirmity, weakness will not be to the advantage of death, but in behalf of, for the sake of the glory, judgment of the God, in order that the thoughts, glory, splendor of the Son of the God be throughout, or be made known by means of it. Interesting language. One of the things that I find interesting about this, regarding the fact that this sickness will not be to the advantage of death, is that our ancient rabbis actually divided sicknesses into those that were commonly linked to death, so commonly seen to end in death, and those that did not commonly end in death. They actually had a halachic ruling on this. Such and such an illness would most likely end in death. Such and such an illness, like cold or whatever, would most likely not end in death. So what I'm saying is that we had this paradigm where we understood that sicknesses were divided into these two camps. Here's the thing though. What was radical about what Yeshua said was, he was saying of a sickness in the camp of, it will definitely end in death, this will not be to the advantage of death. He put Lazarus's certain death sickness into the temporary cold category. So for any of his disciples hearing this and understanding this paradigm, they would have understood it in quite a different way to what we do today. Isn't that interesting? I think it's interesting to look at, okay, the Greek doxa and in Hebrew lechavod, the glory and judgment of God, as we've talked about before, they're intrinsically linked, glory and judgment. And then, but it's interesting that it goes on to say that whatever will happen to Elazar, to Lazarus, will be for the glory and judgment of God. So we're already being told why this sign will happen. But it's big picture why. It will be for the glory and judgment of God, in other words, to bring about his redemptive purpose so that he can be seen as the righteous judge. And then it goes on to say, in order that the thoughts, glory, splendor of the Son of God be throughout. And this is pretext to the redemption of the Jewish nation. It's pretext to the resurrection that surpasses all resurrection, because it makes possible the final resurrection, and that's the resurrection of Yeshua himself. Reading on to verse 5 and 6. Now Yeshua loved entirely Martha and her sister and Elazar. So when he heard that he, Elazar, Lazarus, was sick, weak, powerless, he then stayed 2 days in the place where he was. Maze. He loved Miriam and Martha and Elazar entirely, and so he stayed where he was for 2 days. What is counterintuitive? I was playing that TV game. You know how you... Never mind. You young people don't understand that. Okay, so this is not a normal human emotional response. He loved them entirely. Okay? This is like if I heard that Mark Tuta was about to die from an illness, and I loved him entirely, and then I said, okay, Julia, let's just stay put here at home until he's cupped it, because that's how much I love him. Good example, eh? Because it sounds like it's a contradiction. If you love Elazar entirely, you would rush the 100 kilometers to get to him, to heal him, so that he doesn't pass away. That would be a normal human response. Normal. God loves us beyond our circumstances. His goal for us isn't temporary healing. His goal for us is eternal life. So because Yeshua loved Elazar and Miriam and Martha, and because they trusted him but didn't yet know the fullness of what he had come to do, he stayed put. Sometimes love doesn't look like love, at least not the love the world knows. Verse 7 and 8. Then after this, he said to the Talmudim, the disciples, let us go to Yehuda. Let us go to Yehuda again. So the region of Judea. The Talmudim, the disciples, said to him, Rabbi. I mean, really, it was kind of like they were thinking, are you Meshuggah? Rabbi. The Jewish religious leaders, Judeans, were just now seeking to stone you. And are you going there again? What the heck? They want to kill you. If Yeshua were physically standing in Israel today, and his disciples were with him, and he said, okay, Achim, let's go to Melekh. Let's go to Bethlehem. They would give him the same response as they're giving him here. Jews don't stay alive in Bethlehem today. So this is what's happening. These guys, there are people in Yehuda, in Judea, who want to kill Yeshua. And he's saying, let's go to Judea, let's go to Yehuda. And it's safe to say his disciples were incredulous about that. Yeshua, so verse 9 and 10. Yeshua answered, are there not 12 hours in the day? Again, he's essentially quoting rabbinical teaching. The rabbis divided the daylight hours into 12 and the nighttime hours into 12. And so he's really just affirming what the disciples have already known from a very young age as Jews in the Canary region for the most part. If anyone walks in the day, Bayom, he does not strike against something because he sees the all-existing light of this world. See, but even though the Greek says phos, the light of this world, in Hebrew would say or. So it has this ambiguous meaning. It is the light of this world, but Yeshua is telling a mashal, a parable. And he's really alluding to his own light that pre-exists all things. And if anyone walks in the night, balayla, he strikes against something. Listen to this. In Aramaic it says, because there is no flame in him. Nahira. Because there's no flame in him. And obviously the Greek and Hebrew say light again. But there's this intrinsic link between flame and light. And notice that the one who stumbles in the dark doesn't stumble because he doesn't have a torch. You understand? So in ancient times they'd light an oiled stick, a torchlight, a fire on a stick. But he's saying he won't stumble because he doesn't have a torch. He'll stumble because there is no flame in him. Verses 11 and 12. This Yeshua said, and after that he said to them, our friend Lazarus, has fallen asleep, but I go so that I may awaken him. The Talmudim, the disciples, then said to him, Lord, Adonai, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover. It's not rocket science. If he's asleep, he'll wake up. What's the urgency? You know, there are plenty of examples in the Tanakh of sleep being used as a metaphor for death. There are. But, as was often the case, they took him literally. 13 to 15. Now Yeshua had spoken of his, Lazarus, death, but they thought that he was speaking of reclining. So Yeshua then said to them plainly, Elazar is dead. And I am full of joy for your sakes. Listen to this stuff. Our friend is dead. Wallah! Simchatenu! Yay, 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 yay! It's crazy, counterintuitive stuff, I'm telling you. And I am full of joy for your sakes that I was not there, so that you may believe, trust, be persuaded. And now, let's go to him. Therefore, Thomas, who is called Didymus, which just means twin. So Thomas, who's called the twin, said to his fellow Talmudim, his fellow disciples, Yalla, let's go, so that we may die with him. So that we may die with him. Actually, who's the him? Yeshua is the him they're saying they're going to go and die with. Why? Because he's going back to Yehuda, where people want to kill him. So this Thomas, who all of us know he's famous as the doubter. Ask any follower of Yeshua, Jesus, tell me about Thomas. Oh, doubting Thomas. Well, good, because without doubt there is no faith. But better still, I see you and raise you he's the guy who was so zealous for Yeshua that he said, Yalla, let's go die with him in Judea. So it turns out we should know him for more than just the time that he doubted, eh? We should also know him for the time that he had some holy chutzpah and said the right thing. It's kind of cool that he doesn't say, I'm going. He says, all of us are going. Yeah, let's all go and die. I can see the other disciples, bro. Slow down, mate. Yeah. So when Yeshua came, he found that Elazar had already been in the tomb, the grave, 4 days. B'chavir. This is a cool time to learn something about grave. In Hebrew, kavir, grave. Certainly in this time period and before this, and even still sometimes today, but in this time period, grave always meant above ground cave or tomb. It never meant buried in the ground. Not for the Jewish people. It's very important you understand that. It actually leads on to you not being deceived by false theologies concerning that place called Sheol. Sheol is the place of the departed. It is not the Hebrew word for grave, even though almost universally English translations translate Sheol as grave. Hebrew has a word for grave, kever. Sheol is a transcendent place. It is not the grave, the physical grave. Okay, so that's important. And it's also important to understand that the Hebrew grave is in a cave, or the rhymes. The Hebrew grave is in a cave, far from the wave. No. Okay, so those are old man jokes right there. Verses 18 to 20. It might also interest you to know that there was this practice amongst, well, it was taught by the rabbis, but the practice back then, and even coming into the 3rd and 4th centuries, was to prepare the body for the grave, take them into the tomb. They would close up the tomb, but they would go back and check on the body for 3 days. Not out of superstition, but because back in the day, their knowledge of medical things hadn't advanced sufficiently for them to always be able to tell the difference between comatose and dead. And there were a number of cases of people being put in their tomb and coming to a day later. And so the rabbis had this halachic practice of going to the tomb for up to 3 days afterward to just check that it was the dead one and not the comatose one. I, for one, would have been very grateful for that practice if I lived at that time. But this is important, isn't it? Because it speaks to why Yeshua waited. You see, had he performed the miracle earlier, they could have just said, yeah, well, that happens. We got it mixed up. The guy wasn't really dead. Big deal. But here's the thing. After 3 days, without modern preservatives, that body, this is not really the story of Yeshua raising a dead man. This is the story of Yeshua raising a rotting corpse. Now, there are stories amongst our rabbis of people being raised after 3 days. But there is no story in the Tanakh, in the Old Testament, or in the New Testament. There is no historical record ever of anyone being raised after 4 days. We have record of people being raised after one day in modern medical circumstances, and obviously some of those are Holy Spirit powered miracles that doctors can't work out. But there's no record of 4 days. Why? Because the physical state of the body makes it impossible for medical science to resurrect the body. And this is what? Over 2,000 years later. Now, Beit Anya, house of answering, was near Yerushalayim, about 5 kilometers away. And many of the Judeans had come to Martha and Miriam to console them concerning their brother. Many of the Judeans, many of the religious leaders had come to console Miriam and Martha. They were connected to Perushim and Sadducees who had come. Elazar was obviously a special man, and they'd come to console them over Elazar, Lazarus. Martha, therefore, when she heard that Yeshua was coming, went to meet him, but Miriam was sitting, babait, in the house. Interesting that the Greek says sitting. There are a number of other Greek words that could have been used to specifically say she stayed behind, or she waited, or she held her place. But the Greek specifically says sitting. Why? Well, I can tell you why. Every Jew reading this knows why. She was sitting Shiva. She was sitting the 7-day mourning period of the Jewish people on a low stool, close to the dirt in her house, without shoes on, and people were coming to feed and look after the family. Why did only Martha leave? You might be asking that. Well, the text only tells us that Martha heard. The text doesn't tell us that Miriam heard that Yeshua had arrived. The text tells us that Martha heard. Probably someone came in and whispered it to her while the mourning was going on. And without thinking or telling Miriam, she rushed out to meet him. Why? Because Martha is also more than her failures. Why? Because, well, not so long ago, Yeshua had said to Martha, your sister has valued the better thing. And Martha must have taken that on board. And so she rushed to the only one she knew could do something about this situation. And she didn't tell her sister, so her sister remained sitting Shiva because she didn't know about it yet. Verse 21-23. Martha then said to Yeshua, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Wow. That's faith. Even though my brother was dying from a sickness that ends in death, if you had been here, he wouldn't have died. Wow, that's Martha. You know, the busy one, doing the dishes. While Miriam, the holy one, was at Yeshua's feet. Well, yalla, now Martha's a holy one too. So here we go. If you had been here, my brother would not have died. Even now, I know that whatever you ask of the God will give you. The faith on this woman. I don't hear Yochanan or Mattiyahu or Kepha or any of the other disciples speaking like this. I hear a woman speaking like this. Yeshua said to her, your brother will rise. Actually, it's in the Hebrew it says, kum yakum. Your brother will and has risen. That's what the Hebrew says. That sounds like someone who has a grasp of time and space and everything outside it, eh? Kum yakum. Rise, he has risen. Well, that's flipping awesome. Brit Chadasha in Ivrit. Yeah. Okay, 24 and 25. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise, Yakum, or he has risen, future tense, in the rising, that is the resurrection, on that last day. Okay, so she'd been listening to the teaching of the scholars, the rabbis, the Peroshim, not the Sadducees. So we know something about Martha's religious belief. She held the theology of the Peroshim, of the Pharisees. She believed in the resurrection at the last day. The Sadducees didn't. I know that he'll rise on the last day. Do you guys get as excited as I do about this next verse? Yeshua said to her, I am the rising and the living, because it's Chaim, not just Chai. And the Aramaic's cool. The Aramaic says, I am the all-existing resurrection, rest, and the living. The Aramaic word is nuchama. In Aramaic, the root for that word is rest. It means to rest. So in Aramaic, the word carries the meaning of both rest and resurrection. And isn't that what elsewhere we read about the Shabbat that remains for all? That is the final rest, which is the world to come. So the Aramaic's kind of telling us with one word that the world to come is also the infinite Shabbat, the eternal rest. I think that's cool. He who believes, trusts, is persuaded in me will live even if he dies. And the Hebrew, again, it's worded a bit differently. It essentially says, also because he has died. And really, when we think about that, both are true, right? Because anyone who wants to live forever must die to themselves. So really, the meanings of these different languages don't change what's being said. They illuminate it. They fill it. So that we're not limited to just the one idea, but the fullness of the idea. I find that exciting. Before we go to 26 and 27, so Yeshua says, I am the all-existing resurrection, the rest, and the living. I am. And the I am is like, I am that I am. So this is now the seventh. We've got 7 in total of the I am statements in John. I'll read them to you. Okay, because lots of people are still saying Yeshua is a good man, a good teacher, might even be a Messiah, but he's not God. It's a thing. Even Christians are saying this today. I know. They should probably lose the term Christian, but they call themselves Christians and they say Yeshua was a good man, but he wasn't God, or he gave away those God powers and he only got them for a certain part of his ministry. This is what people teach. He says, John 6:35, I am the bread of life. 8:12 and 9:5, I am the light of the world. 10:7, I am the gate. 10:11 and 14, I am the good shepherd. Literally, good shepherd, a title for God from the Tanakh. Here, 11:25, I am the resurrection and the life. 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And 15:1, I am the real vine. 7 times, Yeshua literally states that he is present deity. Imanu, with us, God. I know you guys are in the choir, but I just like talking about it. Beseder. Verse 26 to 27, and everyone who lives and believes, trusts, is persuaded. That's us. Everyone who lives and believes, trusts, and is persuaded in me will never die. Do you believe, trust this? He's talking to Martha. She said to him, yes, Lord. I have believed, trusted. Ya Amen. It's past tense. Yes, Lord, I have believed, trusted that you are the Mashiach, the Son of God, he who comes into the world. You want to look for where God's about to perform a catalytic, powerful, miraculous movement. Look for the women. Seriously. Look for the women. They're the ones who seem to be, who seem to have a little less pride and a little more willingness to take on board what God is about to do. And then us men kind of work out that we should have been more responsible and we step up. But it takes the women to get us to notice what's going on. Because this is coming from Martha. It's not coming from one of the disciples. It's coming from Martha. When she had said this, she went away and called Miriam, her sister, saying secretly. Notice she said secretly. And also notice she just yelled out of Shiva. It was considered a sin by the rabbis to break Shiva and go running off somewhere. You were there 7 days, you stayed there. You didn't go off somewhere except to the grave. That was the only place that you were allowed to go. So Martha, who had been so careful about everything needing to be in order when Miriam was at Yeshua's feet, she's chucked that, mate. She's like, if Yeshua's in town, I'm there. Give me 10 tickets, I'll also buy some for my cousins. So she went and told Miriam. Notice she told her secretly. In other words, she came into the house where Shiva was taking place, whispered it in her ear so that it wouldn't humiliate Miriam or let the religious Jews from Judea, who were intimately known to the family, know that they were about to yell out of there. The teacher. She uses different language. The Talmudim have been calling him Rabbi. Fine, there are a lot of rabbis. But Martha uses the determiner the and the word for teacher, not rabbi. She makes Yeshua different from all other rabbis. She says he is the teacher, the one above all others. That teacher is here and is calling for you. Yeshua had asked for Miriam personally. And when she heard it, that is Miriam, she got up quickly and was coming to him. Now Yeshua had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. Then the Judeans, and some of them Jewish religious leaders, who were with her in the house and consoling her, when they saw that Miriam got up quickly and went out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb, the grave. Right? Because she's a good religious Jewish woman who sits Shiva. So the only possible place she could be going is to the grave. Because she's an observant Jew. That's where they thought, that she was going to the grave to mourn there. Therefore, when Miriam came where Yeshua was, she saw him and fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Sound familiar? I mean, these sisters are on the same wavelength, man. When Yeshua therefore saw her mourning, and the Judeans who came with her mourning, he was deeply moved in spirit and was indignant, angry, anxious, agitated, distressed. Yeshua was anxious. Some people will say, no, Yeshua can't have been anxious because God says, don't be anxious. Why would God say, don't be anxious, if no one ever got anxious? I mean, the logic floors me. Yeshua was anxious, but the Greek denotes that he was angry, indignant. I think he was angry at those pesky Jewish religious leaders, those Judeans. You fake mourners, you don't love Elazar. Wrong. They were friends of Elazar. They were friends of the family. Yeshua liked these people. He liked the Perushim. They believed what he did. They just didn't always do it. He was angry at something, but he wasn't angry at people mourning. You really think God gets angry at people mourning? Of course you don't. He wasn't angry at people mourning, but he was angry. He was angry at the fruit of sin. Sin entered the world and death with it. He was angry because people had to mourn, because sin bears the fruit of death. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" And they said to him, "Lord, come and see." They said to him, well, the nearest subjects are not only Miriam and Martha, and probably the disciples, but also the Jewish religious leaders and Judeans. They corporately said to him, "Come and see." Yeshua wept. People make a big deal about that being the shortest verse in the Bible. Wake up call, there are no verses in the Bible. Okay, Yeshua wept, so the Judeans, the religious leaders, were saying, "See what great love he had for this dear friend." But some of them said, "Could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind man, have kept this man also from dying?" Some of these guys were the guys who witnessed or saw the aftermath of the healing of the man born blind. So Yeshua, again being deeply moved within, came to the tomb, the grave. Now it was a cave, and a boulder was lying against it. Yeshua said, "Remove the boulder." Martha, the sister of the deceased, said to him, "Lord, by this time there will be a stench, for he has been dead for 4 days. Like I said, rotting corpse." Yeshua said to her, "Did I not say to you that if you believe, trust, you will see the judgment, glory of the God?" So they removed the boulder. Then Yeshua lifted up his eyes and prayed. And Jews pray with our eyes open. We always have. Yeshua was praying like a Jew. Like this. Look, I'm not saying it's wrong to pray with your eyes closed. That's not the takeaway here. All I'm saying is Yeshua didn't do this. He lifted up his eyes, and the thing is, he didn't actually even need to do that, and we'll find out why in a minute. He lifted up his eyes and said, "Ave, I thank you that you have heard me. My Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I perceive that you always hear me. But because of the crowd standing around, I said it, so that they may believe, trust, be persuaded that you sent me." Yeshua could have walked by the tomb, thought resurrection, thought boulder float into the air and explode, thought, I'd love some falafel. All I'm saying is he didn't need to say or do anything. He is God with us. But wow, he didn't need to. So that means the only reason he did any of this in the end was for the sake of the redemption of his people and for the sake of our redemption, you and I. All of this. He is not a show-off. Have you ever noticed that it seems like the things of the enemy are all full of flair, performance, lighting? It's a performance. The enemy is like a magician looking for applause. Not Yeshua. Yeshua has our best in mind. So that's why I said it, not because I needed to tell you I want to talk to you, Father, because you and me are constantly in conversation. 43 and 44. When he, Yeshua, had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Alazar, cum se. Lazarus, arise, come out. The man who had died came out, bound from head to toe with wrappings, and his face was wrapped in cloth. Yeshua said to them, loose him and let him go. Therefore, many of the Judeans and the Jewish religious leaders, many, Rabbah, who came to Miriam and saw what he, Yeshua, had done, believed, trusted in him. And that's to add to the several thousand that believed several Passovers ago, and the several thousand that believed during Sukkot, and the several thousand that believed while he was going around the countryside doing miracles, and the several thousand that believed when he fed the 5,000, the 23,000. Plus these. So when I said the start of tonight, tens of thousands of Jews believed in Yeshua even before he died and resurrected, I wasn't bluffing. It's the fact. We're just never told about it. We're always told this story like, a few Jews believed, but most of those Jews didn't. No. I just love that. And some of them went to the Perushim and told them the things which Yeshua had done. We could say, and some of them went to telltale on him. Or we could say, some of them went to the Perushim because they now believed, and they knew that the Perushim believed in the resurrection. So they didn't go to the Sadducees, because they were definitely not going to buy what they were selling. They would have just said, you're making up stories. But they went to the Perushim because they knew, they believed in the resurrection, and that this kind of miraculous resurrection might just be enough for them to believe that he is the King Messiah. What if we looked at it that way? Because we could. We don't have to say those are the bad telltale guys who went to telltale on Yeshua. No. Maybe they went to share the gospel as much as they understood it at that point. Therefore, the heads of the priests, and the priests by majority were Sadducee, not Perushim. Okay? So the heads of the priests and the Perushim, and this is why there's this distinction, because now the religious Jew is going, what? These guys are getting together? Must be a meeting of the Sanhedrin. Otherwise, these guys wouldn't want to spend too much time together because they have these totally different theological perspectives. They convened a council, and this is probably the Sanhedrin. So they're convening the meeting of the 70 religious leaders of Israel, the Sanhedrin. And we're saying, what are we going to do? For this man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, all the people will believe, trust in him. And the Romans will come and take away both our place, that is our land, and our ethnicity. The Greek says ethnos. This is important. It's important. These guys had a genuine fear that if someone claimed or was proclaimed as Messiah at this point in history, that there was a good possibility that the Romans would come and perform genocide on the Jewish people. And their fear was a valid one. In fact, in 70 AD, the Romans did their very best to do that very thing. And then again, in about 130 AD, the Romans tried again at the Bar Kokhba revolt. So their fear was quite justified. It wasn't godly, but it was justified. And so they thought, if this guy, the way he's going, he is going to convince all of Israel. And if he does, our whole ethnicity is going to be wiped out. Okay, I just want you to understand that they had a legitimate fear. I'm not saying it was godly. I'm just saying it was legitimate. But one of them, Kayapha, and his name means for beauty. Kayapha. Like the town on the coast. Yafo. Who was high priest that year. Okay, it doesn't mean they had a new high priest every year, because we know that Caiaphas was actually high priest for several years from the 20s CE through to about 36 CE. So it's not that there was a new high priest every year. It just means that on this particular occasion, he was high priest. He said to them, "You perceive nothing at all, nor do you take into account that it is expedient for you that one man die on behalf of the tribe." The Greek says laos, the tribe, not the nation. The tribe, meaning the ethnic, religious people of Israel, the Jews. "Lest the whole ethnicity, ethnos, perish." So the tribe, we might say Yehudim, the whole ethnos, all of Israel. He is saying, if we work out a way to get this guy to be killed for being a false Messiah, that will take the heat off the rest of us. Okay? Not terribly nice, it's quite nasty, but look what happens. That thing, moreover, separated him not to speak except as high priest. What he said actually separated him to be speaking of God. So separated him from himself, from his own flesh, so that what he spoke with the intention of doing harm to Yeshua, in fact was prophecy of God, because it says he prophesied that year that Yeshua was going to die for the ethnicity of Israel. Yes, and not for the ethnicity only, but in order that he might also gather together into one the offspring, teknon, of the God, who are dispersed. This, folks, is the one time I can find where he's not saying the dispersed Jews, but the offspring of God being every human being dispersed throughout the world, who is to become one with the Commonwealth of Israel. And it's unique because this kind of language is not usually used. Usually the diaspora is mentioned, other Jews. But here it says offspring as in any ethnicity. And that's why before that it specifically speaks about the ethnicity of the Jews. So he's actually prophesying the redemption of all who will believe, while actually saying he wants to kill off that guy to save his own skin. And out of darkness comes light. Baruch Hashem. 53, 54. So from that day on, they planned together to kill him, Yeshua. They planned together. That is, those who believed in the resurrection and those who believed that the Torah was just a moral code and that when you die, there's nothing, got together to kill Yeshua. So from that day on, they planned together to kill him. Therefore, Yeshua no longer continued to walk publicly among the Jewish religious leaders, Judeans, but went away from there to the region near the wilderness in the village of Ephraim. And there he stayed with the disciples. And I just wanted to show you that particular village is just about 3 hours walk. It's northeast of Jerusalem, but about 3 hours walk, or about 100 kilometers from Bethany. And when it says 3 hours walk, I'm picking probably Eliyahu, you could do it in 3 hours. For me, it's more like 10-hour walk. Okay, so but you can see there how far away it is. Now the Pesach, this is the third time Yochanan mentions Pesach, and notice before this he calls it the festival, Ha-Chag. And that's unique to all the Gospels because Yochanan has this focus on what? the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world. That's why he's constantly mentioning Pesach, Passover. Now the Pesach, Passover of the religious Jews, the Judeans, was near, and many went up to Yerushalayim out of the country before the Pesach in order to ritually purify themselves. Think about that, dead man. There's a process of ritual purification after touching a dead body. Do you have to do that if the body gets resurrected? Some of the rabbis, they had a headache. So he was dead, but now he's not dead. So purification, not purification, I don't know. But what that tells us is that it was at least 7 days before Pesach began, because they were purifying themselves in preparation for Pesach. However, it also tells us that these events happened sometime within about a 3-month period, right? Because last we heard it was Hanukkah. And now we've come full circle back round to Pesach. So sometime in between there is when Lazarus was raised from the dead. Consequently, they were seeking for Yeshua. Okay, they're making aliyah for Passover, right? For Pesach. They're seeking for Yeshua. They were saying to one another as they stood in the temple, "What do you think? That he will not come to the festival at all?" This is an Aliyah festival. What does the Torah say? Every male of age must come up to Yerushalayim 3 times a year. For Pesach, for Shavuot, for Sukkot. What they're saying is, this guy who raised a man 4 days dead, who raised a corpse from the dead, clearly of God, he's not going to obey the Torah and come up to the festival. We don't see him here yet. They should have known the answer. The author of the Torah does not break the Torah. Now the head priests and the Peroshim had given orders that if anyone knew where Yeshua was, that one was to report it so that they might seize him. Yeshua. They didn't seize him. Not until he wanted to be seized. Right? Part of that is because of what we already learned, that so many of them already believed in him. The chief priests and the Peroshim had put out this edict that put the word around. If you're a good religious Jew, you need to dob this guy in. Okay? It's like when Julia and I rang water care the other week. If you see your neighbours using water, dob them in. But these guys didn't want to dob him in. They'd just seen him raise a corpse, for goodness sake. Stinking 1 minute, alive the next. So, that's how we end this chapter. And then next week we look forward to chapter 12.